I would like to welcome you to the second virtual event of the Initiative for the Study of Power, Politics, and Organizing in the US, which is a new initiative, which unfortunately has had its pilot year in the midst of this pandemic, but we're keeping it moving. Just so you know what the initiative is about, we are gathered together here to examine the key concepts that are in the initiative's title. So the study of power, right, which I take to mean the set of relations that produce vulnerabilities and or privileges that compound at the intersections of what political scientists Schlossman, Verba, and Brady call politically relevant identities. That is group level characteristics like race, gender, socioeconomic status, and sexuality that yield reliable and measurable impacts on individual life chances. We also approach the study of politics by examining the ways that ordinary people experience the political, particularly what they understand democracy to be and how they view their role in its achievement, maintenance, and horizons. And finally, the subject of this particular talk is organizing. Now, I really wanted to have an initiative that studied political organizing because, at least in political science, organizing kind of gets short shrift as a unique political phenomena. And what I understand organizing to be, and we will explore this topic with our venerable and knowledgeable speakers here today, but I think of it as a process of meeting, engagement, education, and preparation for collective action that people undertake in the service of some public end. So in thinking about organizing, we are talking about our particular theme this year, which is the politics of care. So today, this evening, we're going to explore the activity of organizing in the context of care and what those two things have to say to each other. Organizing and care as both methods of doing politics, but also as perhaps ethical frameworks that we can think through together in thinking about how to move power relations in a way that can help us to build a more just world. Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. And for me, this is a kind of dream team of folks that I have been able to pull together on a Thursday night to talk with me and us about, I think, these critical issues that hopefully can inform our political thought and our political work. Okay, so first I would like to, this is in just no particular order. First, I would like to introduce Uju Agarwal, whose work focuses on public infrastructures, urban space, racial capitalism, rights, gender, and the state. I should say that Uju is a colleague here at the New School. Her work has appeared in popular outlets, scholarly journals, and edited volumes, including Transforming Anthropology, Scholar and Feminist Online, Education Policy, and Feminists Rethink the Neoliberal State. She is co-editor of What's Race Got to Do with It? How Current School Reform Policy Maintains Racial and Economic Inequality, and co-editor of Women's Studies Quarterly. Her research is informed by over 20 years of working to build local and national organizations and initiatives that work for educational justice, immigrants' rights, and transformative justice, as well as projects that focus on the intersection of the arts and social justice, popular education, and adult literacy. She's on the National Collective of Insight and currently serves on the board of Teachers Unite and as an advisory board member of the Parent Leadership Project. Okay. Next, we have Laura Liu, another colleague at the New School here. Her work focuses on how space interacts with power, politics, and identity to produce uneven material conditions, and also to organize people toward challenging hierarchies and redistributing resources. Her research focuses on community organizing, labor, migration, urban development, and design. She has written about militarized border spaces, anti-sweatshop organizing, geography, industry and art, digital technologies, labor and urban space, and the impact of September 11th on Chinatown. Her articles have appeared in Anthropology Now, Women's Studies Quarterly, Urban Geography, Gender, Place and Culture, and Social and Cultural Geography. She is interested in creative, experimental, and multimodal approaches to research and the collective production of knowledge and analysis. She serves on the advisory boards of the Urban Studies program at Gutman Community College, CUNY, and the MA program in Social Justice and Human Rights at Prescott College. She is an inaugural member of the Ann Snittel Prize Organizing Committee. Thank you for being here, Laura. Next, Ray Leiner is an artist, organizer, radical dreamer, creatrix, strategic thinker, abolitionist, healer, facilitator, embodied practitioner, and also my neighbor. Ray is a Black identified, multiracial, queer organizer, facilitator, and activist, native Bronxite, currently residing on Lenape land, Wappingers and Mohican territories known as the Hudson Valley. Possessing an undergraduate degree from Antioch College, they're focused on Africana studies with a focus on aesthetics and intersecting identity in 2005. Their movement-based work is focused on social and racial justice and movements for transformative change, centering the needs of BIPOC community members through fostering interdependency, emergent strategy, embodiment practices, and healing justice. With a diverse background in an analysis of race-based inequity within the United States through an intersection and environmental justice lens, Ray has designed and developed curricula to support culture shifts toward an anti-racist approach to work within the nonprofit sector. Their current professional work consists of deep anti-racist equity, LGBTQ plus cultural humility, and systems change work in the healthcare industry. Ray is an active member of the Black Lives Matter Hudson Valley chapter, co-founder, and their co-founder thereof, and acts as lead organizer at the Newburgh LGBTQ Center, whose mission centers on developing the leadership of queer people of color in the mid-Hudson Valley. Erin Pineda is next. Assistant professor of government at Smith College, where her work focuses on activism, protest, and organizing in democratic theory, with a focus on the Black freedom movement in the 20th century. Her book, Seeing Like an Activist, which I'm so excited for reading, I have to say, Civil Disobedience and the Civil Rights Movement, shows how civil rights activists in concert with anti-colonial movements across the globe turned to civil disobedience as a practice of decolonization in order to emancipate themselves and others, and in the process transform the racial order. Her work has also appeared in Contemporary Political Theory, European Journal of Political Theory, and History of the Present, along with the Boston Review and the London Review of Books. So as you can see, we have a panel with a myriad of experience and expertise here. And so without further ado, let me just move into the opening question. It's my hope that as we go forward, that you all will talk to each other as much as you talk to me. And also that those of you who have come to join us, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, because we will definitely have ample time to engage with those questions at the latter part of the talk, okay? So first, let me just ask, from your experience, and in this, I would actually like to begin with Ray. In your experience and in your view, what is organizing? Do you think of it as distinct from mobilization or activism? How so, and how might these things overlap?
That is an excellent question, Deva. I think that in this moment, folks are throwing around terms like organizing or organizer pretty freely, and not really being able to make the distinction between organizing and activism. So organizing, to me, well, I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about this later on, but I'm just going to jump the gun just a little bit. So I'm an organizer who was brought into organizing through the Alinsky style model of organizing, which is really about building a base, right? If you are trying to make an impact on social change, you need to have a base. You have to have a base of folks that you are working with, because individually we may not possess a lot of power but collectively we possess a lot of power. And as a tactic that has been used globally as a strategy for being able to hold accountable government, hold accountable all kinds of targets, you need a base of people to be able to do that, right? So I see organizing as more as being able to understand a strategy for how to apply pressure within systems in order to exact change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so organizing, we use mobilization, right, as a tactic and a skill. So I have a base of people that I work with. And when we have to put pressure on an elected official, what we'll do is we will develop a mobilization plan. So that means that we are going to activate a network of people that we have outreach to that may be receiving our messages, our emails, might be following us on social media. And then we will develop like a script or a rap, or basically some kind of messaging to make sure that people are clear about what we're asking them for. And then we will then activate those people to then apply pressure, right? That's one example of mobilizing. This past summer, I mobilized a small but lean group to show up at a Dutchess County legislator's home because they were getting ready to vote on prison expansion in Dutchess County. And so, this was like over $200 million that's going towards creating another institution that predominantly targets people of color, disproportionately targets queer people of color. And all of this while ignoring the obvious disparity that exists within the county, right? And so why does this person get to be comfortable in their home whilst the rest of us get racially profiled in ours? So we showed up to his home and we moved a bunch of people. We had a lot of messages and it was great, right?
Mm-hmm.
We brought activists with us, people who were passionate about what we were doing and wanted to have boots on the ground and were there with the rah rah and all that energy, which is great. I now find that I am an elder in movement work, which is kind of scary for me. But, we leverage those activists and their energy to show up at a target's house for a specific reason, right? So organizing has strategy. Mobilization is a tactic. It's a tactic that we use to move people. So, I feel like from last year with the uprisings, a lot of people have gone into the streets and they're like, well, we did the thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's not the thing. That thing that you did is protest, and protest is not the thing in and of itself. The protest is aimed at moving an agenda,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I know we're going to talk more about the Alinsky style, the ways that we have been indoctrinated into organizing. So I'm going to just pipe down a little bit about that, and then open up the floor for other folks to share their thoughts and view. But yeah, there's a lot to say about organizing, especially at the intersections of care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's get some more definitions out there, though. I don't know who to pass it to. I feel I'm feeling a pull towards you, Laura, to open up on this question as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deva. And thank you for inviting me to this event. It's exciting to be in conversation with all of you. I want to just put out there that I will probably tag team a bit with Uju because we did sort of collectively approach this, and we do so much collaborative work together, which has just been a total joy for me. I think this question is really important. And as Uju and I were talking about it, in many ways, I think the drive to kind of define and delineate organizing, especially in distinction from some of these other things, for us kind of drove us to want to ask about a question about the question, and sort of, opening up the idea of who an organizer is, because I think that what organizing is sort of requires that you give some thought to who an organizer is. And in a way, we wanted to shift that a little bit to be less about who or what organizing is or isn't, and what what that work is or isn't, and think about some of the traditions that we draw from that sort of address it more from the lens of what is the work that needs to be done and how do we get there. So in my own work, which is largely focused on worker-centered organizing, which lives in a very interesting kind of in-between space in a lot of ways, at which I was an organizer for a while, but would make the distinction that I'm not a worker-centered organizer now. And so again, sort of positioning ourselves, I think, becomes important for this. But it's not so much a particular definition as a sense of what needs to be done, which I think has driven so much community-based organizing. And I know Uju has some things to say about this.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So yeah, just to reiterate, it was, thank you for having us, inviting us, and it was definitely kind of, I learned a lot by thinking together, learn a lot by thinking together with Laura about these questions, and as we prepared. So so for me, how, just to kind of situate myself, as I shared with some of you before, I entered this work through kind of that organizing being my first kind of long career, I guess, as a full-time paid organizer for a number of years before I moved into teaching at a university. And a lot, as Laura mentioned, kind of this question of how we enter the worlds we straddle, we found impactful to kind of thinking through this question of how do we even approach this question of organizing? And for me, when I entered into organizing work, it was really important, which was kind of centered on kind of building leadership, power, and organizing among poor and working class women of color. It was really important to kind of think about who are we as our whole selves, right? So this question of, for example, at the time, it was in the aftermath of the 1996 kind of welfare immigration, effective anti-terrorism and effective death penalty acts, right? So all these kind of horrific draconian laws being put into kind of moved into the world, very much similar to kind of how we might think about the period through which we're living now. And at the time, people just wanted to kind of connect, tell people how to tell their stories, right? Say, well, show up here and have you had this experience and come here and do this, right? But people often found that their whole selves wasn't necessarily represented. And so for us, it was really important to then open up a space, right, through which people were able to tell their stories, center their stories, tell their full stories, and then from there build collective analysis and understanding of our stories together. So a really central piece for, I think, both Laura and I, building out of kind of traditions of popular education is the building of collective knowledge, kind of building of collective knowledge, building of collective analysis towards, right, shifting towards kind of understanding how power works, the dimensions and structures of power, but understanding that collective kind of analysis of the world and centering kind of the fullness of all of our experiences and thinking through them together is something that then produces perhaps a different analysis of what it is we need to change and how we get there. So that really is central to kind of storytelling and the significance, again, of understanding those stories as central to the building and development of a collective analysis of power and the structures of power that need to be changed is, I guess, one kind of piece that I wanted to add here that grows out of the conversations that Laura and I had together.
Absolutely, right. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes organizing distinct from other kinds of political phenomena is the development of a collective analysis that comes out of people's own stories and how they are analyzing them together. We're going to get back to this question of the whole self and what that is. But yes, thank you for that. Erin?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much also for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to appear with my co-panelists, who I'm really eager to learn from. So I came to understand this distinction between organizing and mobilizing through thinking about and with the US civil rights movement. And through the work of SNCC organizer Bob Moses. And so he differentiated famously between these two traditions of the civil rights movement, one that was oriented toward direct action and the kind of dramatic, spectacular mass mobilizations that sort of live on in the public memory of the movement. And then a second tradition oriented more toward building new relations of power, organizing a mass base, as Ray talked about, cultivating local leaders, doing this storytelling work that Uju talked about, this evolving analysis of power that comes out of those who are organized, out of the organizing process itself. And so, Moses developed this distinction to kind of name a rift that he saw in the movement and describe these two approaches that didn't always go hand in hand. The direct action approach, which he felt was like too oriented toward these dramatic displays and one-off actions, and was could be a sort of spectacular politics of petition. But then this other tradition that he was rooted in and devoted to, that was about this slow, hard, and sometimes unseen work of building relationships amongst the marginalized, really in order to cultivate and awaken an understanding of oneself as a democratic agent, as someone who can act in order to address conditions of unfreedom in your life, and as someone who really can act to transform society. And so that's the sort of way that I started to think about the distinction. But I think, resonant with some of the things that others have said, I think working with that basic distinction and with the understanding that organizing and mobilizing are not the same, I think we can start to see how they're connected too. And Ray talked quite eloquently about this. So in the sense that mobilizing a group of people requires organizing, our interests are not obvious even to ourselves. And I think existing institutions, particularly oppressive ones, work to foster a sense of powerlessness and lend, beyond powerlessness, lend a sense of inevitability or permanence to existing arrangements. And so simply mobilizing for a purpose requires the prior work of organizing. But I think organizing also, at least to some extent, requires mobilizing, because this cultivation of democratic agency is always for something, and it requires some kind of outward directed action. One way to think about it is that I have to be able to see myself as acting in an effective way, as having an effect on the world, in order to really buy into this idea of myself as powerful. And so I think, expanding the idea of mobilizing beyond protest, mobilizing can take various forms. That's not the only output. I try to think about the two as fundamentally linked in that way.
Yes, I think, learning from all that you all have sort of put on the table here, I think that becomes more and more clear how important it is to understand the distinct functions of especially organizing and mobilizing, but also activism, but also to take seriously the ways that those things are connected and fundamentally built one atop each other. But just being really clear about those connections, I think is helpful so that we can understand how it is that people become democratic agents who can work together, right? But also improvise together, right? That's the other thing, that organizing allows us to be improvisational regarding the question of, right, Laura's, what is to be done, right? And that's the sort of real power, I think, in it. So now that we've sort of laid the groundwork in the question of organizing, let's explore this concept of care. Particularly in this 21st century Black liberation movement, the concept of care is really central. But there's a lot of room to think and talk about what it actually means and what we ought to take from it, the concept, as both a kind of ethical, framework, but also as a set of techniques. And so that is kind of what I want to put on the floor for folks to discuss at this moment. How should we think about the concept of care in the context of organizing? And I will throw this first to Ray. Do you want to begin again? Particularly because of your work on healing justice, I feel like I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I can do that. That's fine. So I mean, this conversation about healing justice is kind of, it's a very nuanced conversation, I think, in a lot of different spaces, depending on where you are. The
Can you
conversation.
first tell us what healing justice is for those who might not know?
Sure. So healing justice is an approach to understanding that we have inherently experienced or have inherited harms as people who are at the intersections of race, class, gender, and sexuality. And that finding spaces for liberation mean understanding the ways in which our collective system has taken away things like food or rest or even payment. As a way to continue to keep us inside of a cycle of oppression and control. And so when we're thinking about healing justice, we're thinking about what this is like a strategy for me to think about what does liberation look like? What does bodily autonomy look like? What does it look like to be in solidarity with my environment? What does it mean to start to think and dream outside of systems of oppression? So thinking about what does that care actually look like, right? And when I think about this, I oftentimes think about the times that I was doing really hardcore organizing and the ways in which there were systems set up to like give people access to time off. But were we encouraged to do that? No, right?
Mhm.
The culture was very go, go, go. The issues are always there. The feelings that you are behind or you haven't fulfilled all of the things that you need to fulfill during a period of time. The ever pressing urgency is real. And also, I am a person, right? And so I personally experienced burnout that led to I was in the emergency room. I wasn't sure what was wrong with me. I thought that, I have multiple sclerosis that runs in my family. So the symptoms that were showing up, I thought I must be maybe developing multiple sclerosis. And I was at the age around the time that my dad had also developed it as well. So I myself was terrified, right? And it's because, organizing spaces or the nonprofit industrial complex does not take into account or hasn't before in the past. And I feel like there's a lot of shift happening at this moment to be more ethical about the way that we're doing the work or sustaining the work, whilst also dealing with the urgency of the moment, which is always pressing, is to make sure that people are taken care of, right? So for me, this piece about healing justice has been about understanding the ways in which oppression is living in my body and what the hell does liberation actually look like? What does it feel like? How do I speak it? How do I embody it? What am I saying to people in my own organization? How am I structuring policy that actually respects the people that I work with? How can I build an institution and a space where people are working, they're passionate about what they're doing, and also go take a nap, right? Like take some time off. Like you're working too hard right now. It's showing up because you are cranky, you are agitated, you are picking on other people. It is feeding into other kinds of dynamics within the organization, and we are people. We have dynamics. Things are messy. That is just the nature of life, right? So what does it actually mean to be like, hey, I need you to prioritize like that you're taking a nap. I looked at your schedule. It looks like you are on. You have been corresponding since 8 o'clock this morning. You have program until 9 o'clock. You taking a break? What does that break look like? And when I say a break, I'm not talking about you're running and doing this and doing that and the next thing. I mean, did you take a nap? Did you eat some food? Did you drink some water? Did you take care of yourself? Right? And
so
then
that you can do the work.
you can function, right? And then beyond that, because, capitalism got us. we are in these streets being like, well, my self-esteem and my worth is connected to my ability to have productivity. I have to produce something, right? And so, you know, at least in the work that I've been able to do with my team at the center, what I do with folks is I put them through a couple of mandatory trainings. One of them is it's a retreat called Practicing Justice, and it's a retreat that is headed up by my teacher, mentor, and dear friend Rusia Mohudin from Universal Partnership. You should check out her stuff. And she collaborates with the Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, author of Being Black, second Black queer Buddhist to receive transmission in the United States, also author Radical Dharma. And they do a retreat that is specifically aimed at people doing social justice work to start to lay the foundation of where we're dealing with trauma, how it is showing up in our movement spaces, how are we out of alignment with who we want to be in the world, and how do we start the process of reclaiming that space for ourselves? Because the role of white dominant culture and white supremacy has fed us all of these different messages. And we practice that, we're socialized towards it, right? I also make people go through the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond for Undoing Racism, because I need people to confront those things, right? Because a lot of what we're confronting when we're talking about healing is we're confronting these societal norms that are very much so embedded in organizing culture within the US context, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fast pace, I have a campaign, it's got a deadline, we have to win. How does this look to funders? What happens when the funders are displeased with what it is that we've done? We have to change strategy. What if the funder doesn't like the shift of strategy, right? Like those kinds of pieces are things that we have to consider. And then another thing that I have people do is I've developed my own curriculum in collaboration with my partner, the Professor Yasmin Saidullah, who also is an author for Radical Dharma, and we're calling the project the Manual for Liberating Survival. And it's an embodiment tool that we're using. It's a cross-section of embodiment and historic context and movement-based history for people to begin to like build up their muscles to understand, like, you know, this work is always going to be there, but your body is not if you don't take care of yourself, right? I structure when we were able to be in physical spaces together, I structured things. We went to the beach. Today we're working at the beach. And what does working at the beach looks like? It looks like you're taking a nap. It looks like you're playing ball. It looks like you're getting into the water. It looks like we are in a space where we are practicing collective care with each other. Because, you know, again, this piece about how we are going to sustain ourselves when everything in society is telling us these particular messages, right? Productivity, you know, you can't really rest. No naps. Naps are for children. They're for kindergartners. They're not even for first graders. I remember when that got taken away as a first grader, I was devastated, you know? So, I mean, we have to start thinking about like this collective care piece within our own group. And then how are we extending that grace to the community we're working with, to the community that we're in service of? How do we begin to think about that as we structure what do interventions look like as we're listening to people? We used human-centered design as a way to know how to deliver and what to deliver, either campaign-related work or even service-based work, which we don't do a lot of. But what does it mean to actually address the needs of people who are deprived of rest, of space, to be able to figure out what does care look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, those are all practices. It is hard to confront that socialization, that the impetus for, I need to, you know, self-care looks like me going out to get my nails done. And I'm like, not if you're on your cell phone still posting stuff on social media. And managing 6 projects, right? Like,
well, let's pick up on some of the things that are in that sort of rich explanation. I really like this notion of the messiness of what is involved in confronting our socialization into a culture in a time and place where care is not highly valued, pretty much in any way, right? And that relationship also to the sustainability of social justice work. I think that it was Toni Morrison who writes that the point of white supremacy and capitalism is basically to make us tired, so that we don't have time or energy to think about how to alter conditions, so that we start to begin to say things like it is what it is, and have that be our approach. So let's continue sort of in this vein, exploring this. Erin, would you like to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in. Something that Ray just said made me think of the way in which we can think about care in organizing as a really deep form of prefigurative politics, in the sense that the means really shape the ends and have to go together. And so the manner in which organizing happens can't undermine the vision of liberation that is its end. Mm-hmm. And so we can think about that in terms of the kinds of relationships that are a part of organizing, that are the product of organizing, can't be hierarchical or dominating, because that isn't going to build the kinds of relationships necessary for liberation. Can't reinscribe hierarchy. But I think we can take that seriously as also saying that it can't purely be, or organizing can't purely be an activity that takes and doesn't give. Mm-hmm. That it can't purely be a draining toll, and that the urgency of the goals can't translate into a lack of attention for care in the work of organizing and care for the work of organizing. And so that's one avenue that I think is really fruitful and important to think about care and organizing. The other thing that I was thinking about sort of in preparation for today is like maybe a little bit too, or at a more abstract level. So we can think about care in organizing work, but I also think that organizing itself is a form of care. Mm-hmm. It's worldly work, it's care for the world. It's work that is invested in tending to relations with others. And that is fundamentally about, I think, or it isn't necessarily the visions of organizing that I'm particularly interested in, are, I think, rooted in a rather profound recognition of our radical interdependence and reliance on one another. So that care for others is also care for the self in one's world. And it's this nurturing of our essentially social selves and the conditions for our own flourishing precisely by caring for and about others and fostering our connections to them. And so in that way, I think we can think about it at those two levels: care in organizing work and care as organizing work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uju or Laura, as the spirit moves.
Sure. And then Laura, feel free to jump in as well, because again, this is reflecting a collective discussion that we had together. But I think in some ways, kind of it goes back to the earlier question, right? How we approach this question is then, how do we think about organizing? Where do we locate the understanding of kind of organizing infrastructures? Who is an organizer? What is a work of organizing? And where do we look then to think about those relationships of interdependency, how people are transforming and caring for one another on kind of despite, right? Despite the conditions that we face every day, and in the face of conditions that we face every day, and how in some ways does that work provide us in many ways that prefigurative map that you're speaking of, Erin, and then force us as kind of, right, people who are thinking about maybe more explicit or formal organizing structures to look there for how we think about building in questions of how we address this question of care and organizing. Right. So how are people, again, kind of holding down one another, right? In the context of, for example, Laura and I on Monday held a really kind of, I would say informative, but it felt transformative conversation through the Vera List Center with folks around the question, around some of these questions of care and organizing. And one of the things that kind of, I think the takeaways for us was kind of thinking about how many of us who have been trained as formal organizers worked within these distinctions, for example, around service and organizing and advocacy, right? But then in everyday life, we know that those need to bleed into one another. And also then in everyday life, we see that the transformative work of care and organizing, or the political work of care and organizing, is often coming outside of necessarily kind of how we understand it to exist within, again, kind of what we designate as formal organizing, what we may recognize as formal organizing structures, or even kind of what has been called, right, the not-for-profit industrial complex. So how do we then kind of work to center that work that you were speaking about, Ray, around healing justice, right, and recognize kind of how that is how that's so essential to how we understand not just a segment, right, as you were saying, but of kind of the world, but really to how we center an understanding of power and transformation and our political work more generally. Laura, do you want to kind of?
I'm going to jump in, and I put a link in the chat for our event on Monday, which was awesome, and which was about revolutionary feminism, plural. And it kind of, just drawing from some of what we talked about with on Monday, International Women's Day, I will note, was about kind of the both multiplicity and the contradictions. So I think, to repeat a little bit what I was saying about organizing, I'm sort of driven to feel like I want to ask about organizing in the plural, or care in the plural, because I think we have a multiplicity of different things that are being considered as care and function as care, and that their position relative to the analysis and to the other kinds of work are, again, really myriad, right? So I love this idea that Erin's bringing forward of like, that there's care in organizing and organizing in care. And that care as a framework, Nadine Neighbor, who was one of our panelists on Monday, talked about organizing, I'm paraphrasing, while caring, and caring while organizing. And I think that care as a lens actually opens up so much more if we really take into account the full contradictory nature of the way that care does play out. So care, we can see as a lens through which we might examine the failures of the state, right? In terms of all that we all deserve and do not get. On the other hand, I think when we think about care in terms of capitalism, we can think about a very, international division of labor, where we know who's, primarily doing paid and unpaid care work. And then care in organizing, I think, does ask us to think about all of the things that, where does organizing stop and care begin, might be one way that I would reframe Erin's question. If we think beyond a kind of individual care lens, right? If we collectivize care, and if we think of care in a context of solidarities as well, where a lot of what is happening right now in our crisis moment around mutual aid, et cetera, this question makes me think about, I spent, some of my research was on one worker center in Chinatown called Chinese Staff and Workers Association, and a sister organization called National Mobilization Against Sweatshops. And the organization over time had sort of described itself very differently. So at one point it was self-help, at one point it was mutual aid, at one point there was independent union, at one point, right, before sort of settling on this worker-centered model. And so even that kind of flexibility and movement suggests that the relationship between organizing, the relationship between these spheres of life, and therefore care as reproductive labor, fundamentally connected to productive labor. And so how do you have an organization interested in thinking about labor issues that's not going to think about care issues, right? Like if you're taking that seriously in the frame of a neighborhood, a community, a place where the spheres of life connect, then you're fundamentally going to have to, right? That doesn't mean there weren't major fundamental contradictions in the way care was understood in the work of organizing, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, essentialized notions would recur about who should naturally do care and in what ways. And I want to lift up a comment that I'm seeing in the chat from Danny about disability justice. And, you know, that to me also suggests that, you know, care is a function of the context of its, you know, political work and analysis. And so care is going to look different depending on the kinds of issues we're bringing together and how we're able to understand them, right? And so the way in which disability justice has forced a different understanding of care in all kinds of movement spaces seems like less a move to say like, oh, we just need more self-care, you know, again, that individual neoliberal frame, and more a way to understand care is fundamental to the work of organizing, right? And that disability justice teaches us one thing about care. Labor organizing teaches us another thing about care, service work, et cetera, right? So just to contextualize and maybe add that multiplicity to this question, you know, those are some of my thoughts.
Absolutely, yeah. And the phrase healing justice comes out of disability justice work, right? It is a term from disability justice work. But it's also, there's so much in what you guys have said, and it's sort of hard to pick out how to move the conversation forward. But I'm really interested in what, Laura, you call contradictions regarding how we can think about and enact care in organizing work or as organizing work. And I'm particularly mindful in the last one of these conversations, our colleague, for those of you who are at the New School, Miriam Tickton, was very careful to warn us that care is also, can be paternalistic and dominative and reinscribe power relations that already exist, you know, in some of the same ways, Laura, that you were saying about like who we understand to be naturally good at, supposed to be doing care, right? Work, you know, so if we're thinking about care in a kind of healing justice framework or in a framework that's supposed to be liberatory, what are the things that we have to keep in mind? And I want to get kind of specific with this question. You know, how is it that in the course of organizing, or if care is a form of organizing, do we understand it and enact it in a liberatory framework rather than a paternalistic or dominative one? And anyone can jump in, whomever feels most moved. Are you gonna make me pick?
Yes, you're gonna have to pick, Deva.
Okay, so I will begin this one with, I will try Erin again.
So it's a great question, and I have some loose thoughts. It's not maybe an answer, you know, but you know, thinking about it, I was trying to think about these two different dimensions or two different ways that care can be dominative or paternalistic. You know, one being some sense that those who require care are deficient in some way, with respect to those that they're being cared for by, or alternatively, this notion of care work as that which is feminized and racialized, and you know, that there are certain bodies that are caring bodies that are meant for that work, and who are always responsible for that work. So I think both of those alert us to maybe different problems or different pitfalls in talking about organizing as care. And just to take up one of them, the former, this sort of paternalistic relationship between those who require care, those doing the caring. One thing that I've been trying to puzzle through is the kind of organizer-organized relationship, and the kind of subtle but inescapable hierarchies that do exist there. So how do we grapple with that? So if part of the work of organizing is producing or making democratic agents, is helping, it is in some ways, yes, meeting people where they are, but helping to bring them somewhere that they wouldn't have gone themselves. So that implies at least some level of knowledge, skill, expertise on the part of the organizer that is in the initial moment lacking in the organized, or not yet there, or not yet fully realized. And so that might just be an inescapable part of organizing. And perhaps one that we need to put front and center, rather than trying to imagine care as fully equitable, fully democratic work from the get-go, that there aren't these subtle forms of power, even in the sort of most self-conscious and careful organizing. So that's more of a question than an answer. But it's something that I've been trying to reason through, and something that I think might be just an inescapable part of organizing.
Ray, would you like to add to our?
What comes up for me, I think, when I think about disability justice and I think about healing justice frameworks, is the notion of interdependence. So I think that piece about the ways in which people are so oriented towards capitalist, heteronormative, white dominant patriarchy is pervasive amongst folks, even the ones that think that they have a grasp or an analysis of the way that those systems work, external from themselves, and don't see how they are operating within them as agents, right? And so when I think about what does it mean to create collective care, I think a lot about what are the conversations that I am having with people about what care is and how are they defining that? I think that those conversations are really hard for people to have, especially when you are in a cycle or have been in a cycle of trauma. The trauma of navigating your intersectional identity in I'm just going to say this, in a white supremacist capitalist context, right? And the ways in which, sometimes when you say that, people get triggered about the term white supremacy. And what I'm talking about when I say white supremacy is I mean a system that privileges white people at the expense of people of color. So I'm not talking about people in hoods that are burning, crosses on lawns. I'm talking about the everyday way that white privilege and white supremacy work and operate within our society, and work and operate within ourselves. Everyone, white people and people of color, right? And so this brings me into a place of the conversations that I have with people on the ground about what does collective care actually look like for us, right? Right now we have a funder who is talking about, all of a sudden these things are on the radars of funders, right? Now it's the hot button issue. So, healing justice is something that they're finally willing to think about and consider whilst they're thinking about funding us. And so I'm like, that's awesome. I would love to take that money. Can you also just devote more money to us for a longer period of time? Because people still, whilst fighting to create alternative structures to survive, are dealing with the trauma of what it means to live at minimum wage. And so having to do things like, I work with folks who are sex workers to be able to make ends meet, right? Some of them are now organizers and they get a salary from us, and the salary is great, but is it the right salary for the amount of work that they're doing? Hell no, right? Because these ideas and notions about care, when we're especially within the context of the funding world, are very, very separate. So seeing that people are in stable places as they are fighting to create systems change, that is care, right? Making sure people can keep the lights on and food in their bellies, right? Meeting basic needs, that is one piece.
Yes.
And then another piece is, what does that how are we having that interdependent conversation where we are like, well, you know, I'm really good at this thing, I can bring that thing, this other person can bring this thing, or I've never experienced, like some of my folks are trans, they can't go into a bathhouse. They're not allowed to have the privilege to go into a bathhouse because of where they are in their transition or not. They are trans. I'm trans. Right? But what does it mean for us to access spaces that are appropriate for us? Right? When we're talking about care, when we're talking about being able to figure out what do these things mean for us? Some folks just need a massage because they've been beat in the streets, right? Some folks are dealing with other kinds of issues connected to their immune system. They need to be able to see somebody who can give them treatment, who can give them care, and is willing to respect their bodily autonomy by sharing or exchanging loving touch. Right? So, I mean, these notions, and I really agree with the piece that Erin raised about, I think it was Erin that raised it, about disability justice and the framework of disability, or no, that might've been Laura, sorry, about disability justice, because honestly, disability justice for me is ground one. It is the foundation from where we need to consider how we are building sustainable movements. How are we able to adjust to meet the needs of our most vulnerable? Because when we do that, we inadvertently meet the needs of everyone. How are we making sure that things are accessible, that people are taken care of, that this is no longer the weight or the burden of one or two people within the organization or within the framework, but we have shifted the framework so profoundly that that is what's happening naturally. That we are socializing or re-socializing ourselves to orient ourselves towards what does care look like, right? And that's hard. That is difficult because care looks different for everyone. But baseline is meeting your basic needs.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, is to say that first is basic needs, but then there's this issue of re-socialization, of transformation, right? Which is something that Uju, you talked about. And I actually loved that phrase that you used earlier, Uju. It was informative, but felt transformative. For me, I feel like that's the heart of what organizing actually is, right? It's sort of gathering together to sort of exchange information and stories that then becomes transformational and becomes, as Ray is saying, a different kind of socialization, both toward democratic action, but also toward what we think of and what it means to care. Yeah, so we are reaching the point where we want to kind of open it up for questions from people in the audience. So let's go ahead and do that. I know we have, so I know that we have some folks who are already in the chat. So let's go ahead, and those of you who might have other questions, please drop them in the chat, or we can enable you to ask your questions and sort of keep this sort of going. So first we can kind of take a question from the chat if we can. Of course, I can't see anything and my dogs are going crazy, which I warned everyone might happen.
You want me to read one?
Yeah.
So this is from Danny. I have a question for Ray and or whoever else wants to answer. How does disability justice and healing justice differ or overlap with one another?
Henry, I think we already did that one.
Yeah.
I mean, we can come back to it, but maybe you could throw another one in.
My apologies. Care is fundamentally local and just the mere mechanics of it. I can see care and organizing meshing together for non-local issues. Care networks do help workers who are doing a massive strike live through the strike and apply pressure to corporate landlords, but I don't know of examples where these care services can extend beyond the end of the strike. Everyday life needs structure, stability, order. Can the panel share their thoughts on this?
Yeah, please go ahead. Do you all think that care is fundamentally local, or is it something that we can think about in a more expansive sense?
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, please.
I didn't offer as my background that I'm actually trained in geography. And one of the things we talk about a lot is scale. And I think, you know, in some ways this brings in the issue of disability justice, which is, you know, allows us to think about the scale of the body as so crucial, as so fundamental, and of bodies, of collective bodies. And also the kind of localness that we often think about with organizing, right? Like even the language we use to signal sort of authenticity in organizing is grassroots, is it has a kind of a local imagination that goes with it, right? Rootedness in a community is part of a kind of connection to, you know, the base, to use the language that Ray was offering us, right? I think though that expanding, like being more expansive about the terminology does allow us to really think about and take seriously, again, the notion of any kind of reproductive labor and all kinds of reproductive labor as fundamental to the sustainability of ourselves, other species, and the planet, right? And so all of that huge frame, and here to go to a conversation, an ongoing conversation Uju and I have been having about the relationship between care and what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls, and I believe was mentioned in your first session, but in the Q&A,
Yeah.
organized abandonment, right? Which is sort of a clear way to understand the organized differential delivery of care, right, at all scales. And so if we're thinking about responses to that, then we would want to think and need to think about how to address that at scalar levels that connect organizing in local places to each other, right? And so, you know, I think the question suggests that there isn't that network, that there isn't that connective tissue among organizing that happens in places, as well as in relationship to movements which see themselves possibly at higher and larger and different kinds of scales. And I very much appreciate the US focus that you've made clear about this initiative, Deva. But I also think that, you know, as we think about the traditions that are lost or that require excavation in the US sense, we also should think about the influences, the global influences. And I know Uju's going to have some stuff to say, so.
Yeah.
Uju?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Definitely the question of scale, you know, and just to kind of say the question of care. So often, like, right, coming out of organizing that was very much rooted in kind of women of color, feminist kind of traditions, the very fact of like what allows you to be in a political space is about care, right? Whether that's language interpretation, whether that's food, whether that's childcare, whether that's other infrastructures that we need to build in there. But then again, it's a question of where is there, right? Where is the political space that we need to be? Where is the thinking and theorizing happening? And how do we kind of trouble those binaries sometimes? For me, kind of this question of relationality that you're pointing to, kind of, Laura, for me, that was blown up the first time when I went to Cuba, right? And saw people caring literally for one another in a way that I could not, I had read about, right? But I couldn't really understand until I saw it in practice, right? Until I saw it in practice and kind of then saw that the kind of relationality, right? The idea of mutuality, the idea of social relations had grown so expansive that it was something completely different, right? Something completely different than that which I could imagine or conceive of having grown up in the United States, right?
But in what way? Can you tell us, like, give us an example or paint a picture?
Well, again, it goes to kind of what Laura's talking about in terms of all the various scales, right? From the home to the neighborhood, to the city, to the nation state. But in a very basic way, it was how children were taken care of, right? Who's responsible? Children were understood to be, right? Who's responsible, and how children then related to other people within a neighborhood association, within a block, within a building, right? And I witnessed that again then when I was able to go to Argentina and kind of visit the unemployed workers movement there, right? Who had occupied factories and who were developing ways to kind of live collectively through occupation, through the act of occupation. But then also kind of one of the things that struck me profoundly, and again, why I go back to troubling this kind of notion of where is a political space of organizing is it's something that I've found through my own work in working with a Head Start center, right? Where kind of poor and working class mothers of color who are excluded, right? Living in a school district that is significantly segregated, find ways, right, and where every teacher in the Head Start Center is a former parent, which is a model of the Head Start, right? But then also where there's an understanding that expands beyond individual rights, individual kind of care, and that again kind of mobilizes, I think, in many ways, kind of the political imaginary that we are working towards, and in many ways don't can't always see before us in again kind of more traditional organizing structures, for at least me, right? So I found this in different places and different spaces, but what it did was speak very much to kind of that multi-scalar, right, space that Laura is speaking about, right, where kind of the individual family is no longer the individual family necessarily, but always kind of already linked and understood, which is how we are kind of structured anyway, right? But this is then formulating that as a space of political opposition, and then questioning also who and how we find value, right? Which this question of disability justice. For me, that question was raised by Grace Lee Boggs when she kind of troubled the notion of, well, who do we value in society? Who do we value in society in terms of production, right? Who's able, is it just who's able to produce as a worker, or is there a different valuation that we're inscribing and imagining for and with one another?
Yes. So much there. I want to get to the next question, but I'm really glad you brought up this notion of responsibility and this also the question of value in relation to the concept of care. I think keeping those things on the table together is so important, because often we don't, I think that there's a lot to sort of unpack with those notions as well. Okay, Henry, can you help us with the next question?
So Rachel Sherman asks, I'd love to hear what others think about the power relations and organizing that Erin spoke about.
How do you think that we deal with, or should deal with, or even telling a mistake about how you wish you had dealt with, an issue of hierarchy in an organizing space between the organizer and the organized? Can I throw this one out to you first, Ray?
Sure. I mean, it's a really challenging place to be in when you are paid to be an organizer versus doing organizing work that's not connected to a paycheck. There are already inherent dynamics that exist because there are some levels of skill that organizers have, and good organizers are developing the skills of the community that they're working with. So that way their role has been decentralized and it helps to alleviate some of those tensions. I know that I have navigated that for a number of years working with people in community spaces where they think that I have the magic bullet answer or I know all the things, and I don't, right? What I do know is I do understand tactic and I do understand strategy, and I also do understand how to build relationships with people because, believe it or not, I don't know all the things. And because I don't know all the things, it's important, at least in my organizing strategy, to build collectivity. So what does that mean? It means that what I am there as in solidarity with the people that I'm serving, I also am there because the issues are directly impacting me as well.
Mhm.
And so that kind of plays a key role, at least in my experience, when dealing with power that comes up, because power is, it's just a part, it's hierarchy is like a part of human nature. It is, I've been rereading a lot of Octavia Butler's books, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Hierarchy in human nature, right, is like, it's like the downfall of humanity in one of her post-apocalyptic novels that I'm like reading the third book of right now. And that hierarchy isn't necessarily a bad thing. What is a bad thing is when you believe that you are better than other people and then wield resources, wield ideas, keep resources away from people, create silos and spaces where people are not able to build interconnectivity. I always think that it's an amazing thing when the folks that I'm working with have better ideas than me, because it means I get to step back and
Mhm.
listen to them. And I think that a lot of that power dynamic ends up shifting and creating all kinds of ruptures. It also can help to center possibility for transformation within an organization, looking at how power is wielded in order to create opportunity for more equity, for an opportunity to pivot or shift. And people who are in positions of power, at least in some of the spaces that I've been in, have been able to galvanize that and take advantage of it. And spaces that I've also been in have not, and have reinforced it. And unfortunately, that has broken organizations, that has broken campaign work, it's broken momentum movement. And is something to be critical of. It is a learning curve, I think.
You know, I really like the way when you started sort of the beginning, you know, a lot of people who have been trained in organizing, particularly in the Alinsky method, talk about leadership a lot, right? Talk about, you know, developing leaders. But the way that you described what you do is to think of yourself as a resource. And I really love that reframing. You know, it doesn't do away with issues of hierarchy, but it really resonated with me to think of to make some room in terms of leader sounds like a person who's always at the head of the parade, right? Whereas resource sounds like someone you can draw upon and who you know, has something to offer, right, in a particular moment for a particular purpose. And that seems to me to align more with what I think of when I think of an organizer. So I don't know what you all think about that, but I think that's really very generative.
I mean,
What do
really,
others?
really quickly, I mean, don't get it twisted. I do a lot of leadership development with people. And the reason why I have to do that is because I can't sustain what I'm doing. Like, I just can't sustain it. So I have a team of people and I'm developing their leadership whilst also getting them to grapple with power. Because that piece about like, well, I'm a leader, so I'm gonna throw my weight around, you know, like I mean, in the words of Kendrick Lamar, sit down, be humble.
Yes.
Okay, like let's be real about why it is that we have to decentralize these ideas and these notions, because they're not sustainable. We cannot sustain movement if we do not decentralize how powers, ideas, tactics, and strategies end up getting formulated or being executed.
Yes, I hear that. Laura, you look like you have something to add.
Oh, do I?
Oh yeah, you just looked attentive, so you got pulled up.
I'm trying to pay attention. Yeah, I think this is such a great conversation. I mean, it makes me think about a couple of things. One is, again, drawing from conversations that Uju and I have had, just the way that, you know, thinking about, you know, resources, right? And we've heard Alinsky as a model a little bit today, but I think about and I feel a tension in the conversation between the more not to be reductive, but sometimes we have this tension. I think these tensions are real in organizing and in care around kind of more instrumental goals and things that are more about, again, as you put it, Deva, the long game of consciousness raising and transformation. And this conversation just makes me think about Paulo Freire and this formulation of, you know, oppressor and oppressed as, you know, intertwined and as sometimes coexistent, right? And the multiplicity we get when we aren't able to clearly designate in that way. And I think that has to do with this really important question of the relationality, again, between, you know, different roles, between power, between, you know, the groups that are always at play, and then I think is always at play and always needs to be attended to, right? And that we're failing if we neglect that, or if we imply that even something that I really value and think is important, but like I think one of your speakers put it really well in the first panel, those who are cared for the least, right? Centering that, right? Which I fully agree with, but I think that move alone doesn't get away from all of the power dynamics that have to be addressed, right? And that there's always this tension between, are we looking to deploy power? Are we looking to acquire power? Are we looking to transform people's own understandings? And I just wanna, it seems important to note that in this moment right now, care work, you know, as we look to the interesting framing for so many essential workers as, oh, thank you for your sacrificial labor, meanwhile, without any recognition or compensation. And so understanding care there as a bridge to a broader set of relationships that we're asking to really have be transformed. And I think that's a possibility we get from attending to the power differences among ourselves in the work itself.
Yeah, you know, I think that this is so critical to understand, particularly in the US context, is that, you know, care work is always lauded, but it is always lauded as naturally sacrificial. Right. And we see this, of course, with the care work of women, right? We see this about the lionization of middle class white mothering, particularly. You know, it's like, oh, it's so, you know, thank you, fantastic, right? The same thing is happening with care workers. Same thing happened with, essential workers and healthcare workers, right? Like, thank you for your sacrifice. Meanwhile, we're going to continue to let you throw yourself into the volcano, right? You know what I mean? It's perverse. And that is one of the sort of dangers of a language of care that we need to be very, very aware of. But I want to pick up on this notion of this sort of networked nature of these things. It's reminding me of the notion of a kind of emergent strategy, right? Of kind of thinking through, and I say emergent strategy, this is from the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, and thinking about, right, and this is Ray's talking about decentralization, and really thinking about leadership and power dynamics in this kind of framework, which allows for sort of leadership, or whomever, you know, whoever is leading the formation, to be more shifting than we normally kind of think about it, and to be able to be located in a bunch of different places, relating to this notion of interdependence that we've also been talking about throughout this conversation. And for me, and I don't know exactly how, it's also related to this, these questions of power, and how do we develop kind of strategies, rituals, habits in which we're able to interrogate notions of power in a fruitful way, even while we're doing the work of developing ourselves and others, right, as resources and as leaders. You know, I mean, maybe that's part of the work, maybe that's the most critical part of the work in organizing, is to how do we develop these routines in which we're interrogating the power relations, you know, that are present in our space, but also in the wider world. I mean, I have the feeling that that's where this transformative power is, or transformative potential, I should say, is located. Yeah, so I guess I'm not supposed to hold forth, but you guys have taught me so many things that I had buzzing in my head. So let me just, we're almost at time here. So I wanna allow each of you to give us your kind of closing thoughts, particularly with a note toward the future. I always like to ask about the future that we imagine. And so what do you hope for the future of organizing in the United States or globally? And what role do you think that CARE can and must play in the achievement of that future? And I will start the same way we started the conversation. I'll throw it out to you, Ray, and then we can move around.
So the way that I feel about this is that we are oftentimes in a place of reacting to injustice that is happening, and we have to. You can't just not react to what is going on, right? There are so many. There are myriads of ways that I can like potentially articulate what that looks like, right? So like an increase in like voter suppressive legislation has been passed in states where there were very clear organizing strategies that had been deployed for at least a decade in order to move people at a critical moment where we needed folks, right? And so all of that work is important and needs to continue. And as we are doing this work, we also need to start investing some of our time, our energy, our coin into the alternatives. What are we building outside of this? What does that look like? Right. And it makes me think back to the question about like, you know, what is this? I think it was about like, what is CARE and what does organizing look like on the smaller scale and on the larger scale? And it just made me think of fractals and made me think of small as everything and small as all. And so the reality is that, believe it or not, the work that you are doing locally on the ground is happening in another place in the US. Somebody else is doing the same thing. They may not be doing it the same way, but they are doing it. And we are all collectively doing it together. Whether or not it feels that way, whether or not it's coordinated or not, there are large coalitions. There's like National People's Action, and there's all kinds of really great coalition work that's happening, and all of that is extremely important. And that coalition work wouldn't be possible if people were not on the ground doing what they need to be doing in order to push the buck, right? So my piece is about, you know, I think a lot of times this Bruce Lee quote that has become fast my favorite, which is that people want to like when you are trying to embody or rise to your ideals, you're going to fall to your practice. And our practice is that we have internalized a lot of these systems that we talk about. So what does the practice look like? How are we practicing care with each other? How are we practicing conflict with each other? How are we practicing support? How are we practicing the new world that we want to envision? What are we doing right now to practice that and manifest it at this moment? Because I'm still going to be fighting against X, Y, and Z things on the ground. And I also need to start shifting some of my energy too. Because we get a clear sense that things are starting to crumble and fall. And if we don't have something to fall on, right, those mutual aid networks, land reparations, skills exchange and building, when things fall, as they inevitably will, where are we going to be?
Yes, thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Laura and Uju, but I just want to lift up this that quote, which I wasn't aware of, is when you're trying to rise to your ideals, you will fall to your practice. I also have to say that I love practice more than prefiguration. For whatever reason, prefiguration gets on my nerves, but practice seems so, right in there. Okay, so sorry, Laura.
Okay, well, I'm going to add praxis.
Yes.
I think for me, that's kind of where it's at. And Uju and I have talked about that a lot. I thinking, you know, forward around this question of care and organizing. One of the things that Uju and I had talked about in preparation and also around our own work is the idea of the way care can reinscribe some of the notions of a kind of intellectual, thought versus doing the action, right? And I think if we spin it around, care could actually completely invigorate our understanding of organizing such that those things are never riven apart, right? That they are fundamentally connected, that you have no knowledge without the doing and you have no doing without the knowledge. And those things are actually very embedded in both the organizing around care and also the care around organizing. And I think that goes to kind of the whole person in a way that, again, Danny has raised as a question in the chat. And as a last thought, I think that I would hope that organizing could get away from, and I think even the idea of like, what do I have to offer, right? I'm a resource, what can I give? Still devolves occasionally to an individualist sense of scarcity, right? And that if we, take seriously the mutuality and collectivity of care, we don't need to view it in that, again, kind of extractive, exchange-oriented way, right? It becomes a bigger, different project in which scarcity itself can be disputed, right? Could we have enough? We could have enough, right?
Right.
Yeah. And just to jump in kind of on two kind of quick points, I think building on what Laura shared and what Ray shared. I think one, just kind of this question of power in organizing and how it relates to care and the question of leadership, right? So I was part of a lot of organizing collectives. We were very intentional that we were not hierarchical, but one of the mistakes that we made or learnings that we had, right, through praxis was this idea that kind of non-hierarchy doesn't mean kind of a lack of recognizing experience, right? If our goal is kind of, as Ray was talking about, also kind of this idea of sustainability, right? Both for ourselves, but our movements, then that necessarily means recognizing and building upon and kind of thinking through kind of the role of experience and difference in organizing spaces, and then where we are working to get to collectively, right? Kind of where we're and how we do that, how we then mobilize those differences within what we're trying to do kind of as a collective endeavor. And then I think the other thing kind of, I think, speaking to this question of crisis, and before I go there, just to give a quick nod, Erin, you work on Robert Moses. I feel like SNCC is such a good kind of model, right? I mean, I think one of the things that I learned from folks who had trained with them, who taught me, was then this idea of like, you have to look for the organizing that already exists, right? And in that context, right? In that context, then how are these global crises then teaching us that, again, we can't work through, we need to be, yes, very strategic, but we also need to understand that our whole selves right now are impacted by like in ever expanding ways, right? And so our organizing needs to catch that. And we need to kind of build movements around that instead of kind of, I think that we're at a point now where we necessarily have to work outside of the not-for-profit industrial complex. But the question is that going to try and catch up to our organizing and contain it first? Or we create the expansive horizons and practices and praxis that we need?
Erin?
Yeah, I'll keep this brief so that you all can get off Zoom as an act of care for you. And not to repeat others, but I'm glad that Uju brought up Bob Moses, because I think one of the things that a lesson that I take, or a thing that I think about, is this question of what are we already doing? Like, what are the practices we are already engaged in that that can be our starting point? And it's funny, being the person who raised prefiguration as a term here, I actually do tend to use practice and praxis more in my own thinking about this to capture precisely the kind of reciprocal evolving relationship between between knowledge and practice, and that eases but doesn't fundamentally fully resolve, the power differentials that are involved in organizing, this open-ended process that Ray talked about, whereby the organizer isn't commanding, but is also, in some kind of reciprocal exchange with those that are being organized. But then the other sort of loosely related thought that I have just to conclude, I think, which is maybe at stake in the earlier question and the earlier discussion of the scale of organizing and the local level. One thing that I've been thinking about is the way that, to some extent, yes, organizing is local and localized, because we begin where we are. But I think it might be a mistake for us to think about local levels as nested within ever higher levels of politics, but instead think about the ways that the macro is already inscribed in the local, in the way, the things
Absolutely.
the kinds of things that Ray was talking about the lessons about productivity that a capitalist system forces us to internalize about our own activity, the kinds of ways that we relate to the environment. So what does it mean to think about organizing that's operative locally, but that is already engaged in sort of interlocking with these larger structures, as already a way that organizing scales up?
Yes. Thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope that everyone who has been with us has felt, provoked into thinking and to also, feeling like your own sort of impetus to thinking through these issues has been encouraged. That's what the purpose of these conversations is for us to continue along these lines and continue to think through these very complicated questions of how we make the world, basically, how we make the world that we want to live in. And so I want to give a special thank you to Ray, Uju, Laura, and Erin for joining and enlightening us. It was really a pleasure, and I hope that we can be together in person in time to come.
Thank you, Deva.
Thank you,
Deva.
really.
Thank you, Deva, so much.